Aaron, we begin tonight with Ron Paul's past that you might not know about. And truth be told, it's a part of his past that we don't know fully about. That's because the congressman who is now leading the polls in Iowa gets kind of prickly whenever he's asked about this. And because, as we just learned tonight, his story appears to have changed over the years as well. Now, that's him today, taking off his microphone, cutting short the questioning from CNN's Gloria Borger. The questions have to do with racially inflammatory writings published in monthly newsletters bearing his name, and these were to paid subscribers during the 80s and 90s. Now, though the articles rarely carried a byline, they were written in the first person and ran in publications such as Ron Paul's Freedom Report, the Ron Paul Political Report, and the Ron Paul Survival Report. Now, this all flared up about 3 years ago when the liberal New Republic did the story. More recently, though, the same reporter writing for the conservative Weekly Standard fleshed out even more details, as have news organizations from the New York Times to CNN. What we've all uncovered are items like this from a 1992 newsletter shortly after the LA riots titled Special Issue on Racial Terrorism. Listen to this. One line reads, "Order was only restored in Los Angeles when it came time for the blacks to pick up their welfare checks." Well, in fact, order was restored when the National Guard moved in. 2 years earlier, in another Ron Paul publication, an article criticized President Reagan for signing legislation approving the creation of the federal Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, complaining, quote, "We can thank him for our annual Hate Whitey Day." Again, these newsletters were written in the 80s and 90s while Ron Paul was out of Congress and had several thousand subscribers. And as I mentioned, a lot of this first came to light in 2008. In fact, Wolf Blitzer asked him about it back then.
Congressman, there's a lot of material there, but let me just try to figure out, how did this stuff get in these Ron Paul newsletters? Who wrote it?
Well, I have no idea. Have you ever heard of a publisher of a magazine not knowing every single thing? The editor is responsible for the daily activities, and people came and go, and there were some people that were hired. I don't know any of their names. I do not, absolutely honestly, do not know who wrote those things.
Did you used to read these newsletters, Congressman?
Not back then. There might have been at times I would, at times, but, you know, I was in a medical practice. I traveled a lot. I was doing speeches around the country. So very frequently, you know, I never did see these. Matter of fact, some of the things you just read, I wouldn't have recognized them.
Now, again, that was in 2008, but keeping them honest, in 1996, when he was running for Congress, Democrats dug up other passages from his newsletters that he did not deny writing. One called late Texas Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, who was African-American, quote, "a half-educated victimologist." And talking about crime in Washington, quote, "Given the inefficiencies of what D.C. laughingly calls the criminal justice system, I think we can safely assume that 95% of black males in that city are semi-criminal or entirely criminal." Nor did he deny writing this statement: "If you have ever been robbed by a black teenage male, you know how unbelievably fleet of foot they can be." Now, he was asked about that and the other two statements as well by the Dallas Morning News. The reporter, Catalina Camia, writing, quote, "Dr. Paul denied suggestions that he was a racist and said he was not evoking stereotypes when he wrote the columns. He said they should be read and quoted in their entirety to avoid misrepresentation." Again, though, at that time, he did not deny writing the passages. 5 years later, though, talking to the Texas Monthly, Paul backed away from all of that. He changed his tune. Quote, "They were never my words," he said, "but I had some moral responsibility for them." He said this campaign aides told him, quote, "Your name was on that letter, and therefore you have to live with it." So that's 10 years ago. He seems to be saying he didn't write the articles, but his staff made him take responsibility. Fast forward 10 years later, he's now blaming the media for bringing it up again. But as you'll see, he's not doing so much to clear the air. In fact, today, Chief Political Analyst Gloria Borger spoke with the candidate.
And let me ask you, I mean, you've been answering a lot of questions lately about the newsletters that were published under your name, and some of the things contained in them were conspiracy theories. Some of them are considered racist, and you've disavowed them completely. But they were called the Ron Paul Report. And did you read them at all when they were published during those years? Did you ever sort of take a look at it and say, you know what, this isn't what I stand for?
Not all the time.
But you did read them?
Not all the time. Well, on occasion, yes.
And did you ever object when you read them?
Well, you know, we talked about this twice yesterday, as CNN have. Why don't you go back and look at what I said yesterday on CNN and what I've said for 20-some years. It's 22 years ago. I didn't write them. I disavow them. That's it.
But you made money off of them.
I was still practicing medicine. That was probably why I wasn't a very good publisher, because I had to make a living.
But would you give it back? If you made money off of them and you disavow, well, charity, if you made money off of them and you disavow it.
You know, I didn't write them, and I don't endorse those views, and I've explained it many times.
So you read them, but you didn't do anything about it at the time?
I never read that stuff. I've never read it. I was probably aware of it 10 years after it was written. And it's been going on 20 years that people have pestered me about this, and CNN does it every single time. So
well,
when are you going to wear yourself out?
When you say it's no, but
when are you going to do that?
Is it legitimate? I mean, is it a legitimate question to ask that something went out under your name?
And when you get the answer, it's legitimate that you sort of take the answers I give. You know what? The answer is, I didn't write them. I didn't read them at the time, and I disavow them. That is the answer.
Well, it's just a question. I mean, it's legitimate. It's legitimate. These things are pretty incendiary. You know,
because of people like you.
No. Come on. Some of the stuff was very incendiary, and you know, saying that in 1993 the Israelis were responsible for the bombing of the World Trade Center, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So,
goodbye.
All right. Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate your answer. I appreciate your answering the questions, and you understand it's our job to ask them.
Thank you. Well, and Gloria Borger joins us now, along with former press secretary for President George W. Bush, Ari Fleischer, and RedState.com's Eric Erickson. Well, Gloria looked like quite an interview there. I mean, you know, as the congressman said, it's not the first time he's faced questions about all this. But when you spoke to him today, he still doesn't seem quite ready to answer them, obviously, did he?
Well, there seems to be a bit of a conflict. You know, on the one hand, he said that he read them on occasion. And then on the other hand, he said that he did not read the most incendiary ones. So it's really unclear what kind of editorial relationship, if any, Ron Paul had with this report that bared his name. He says that it's irrelevant. That was 22 years ago. He clearly doesn't want to talk about it. But honestly, that's the kind of scrutiny you have to expect if you're the front runner in a presidential race.
Yeah, I mean, it's politics, no question. And Eric, I mean, to that point, some people are hearing about this for the first time, but these questions are not new. They don't seem to have had much of an impact on his presidential hopes until now. Well, why not previously?
Well, because no one took him seriously previously, and now he's in first place in Iowa. I got to tell you, I remember the good old days of 2008 when his supporters put my home address and phone number on a neo-Nazi website. And, you know, we don't have to go back to the letters. We can ask Ron Paul why 4 years ago he allowed neo-Nazi websites to fundraise for him. We can ask him why 3 years ago he went on Iranian TV to say that Israelis had set up concentration camps to indiscriminately kill Palestinians. I mean, there's a lot we can ask him, but I think a more relevant question is, if we can't go back and ask him these questions from the late 80s and early 90s, why then can he go back to the 90s and attack Newt Gingrich or Mitt Romney or Rick Perry for things they wrote? It. Does he believe this is a legitimate double standard?
And a lot of people are saying, well, what does it all mean? What's the impact? And Ari, let me ask you that. I mean, first of all, take a look at this poll, if you will, of likely Republican Iowa caucus goers. Ron Paul, as Gloria pointed out, is a top pick, 28% of the vote. Newt Gingrich is up there with him, about 25%. Romney and Perry are the only other two candidates who cracked double digits. I mean, Ron Paul has some of the most dedicated supporters out there, and in a caucus state like Iowa, that can make a big difference. If he wins Iowa, what do you think it means going forward for the whole field?
Well, I think if he does win Iowa, it really doesn't mean much. Mitt Romney is probably cheering for him to win Iowa, because then it's going to propel Mitt Romney forward. Nobody thinks Ron Paul can go anywhere. What really happens here is Iowa being a very small caucus state, 110,000 voters, perhaps 120,000 voters. A small, energized plurality can make all the difference in the world, and that's what propels Ron Paul's candidacy. You know, as anybody who's read my tweets know, I'm not a supporter of Ron Paul. I'm not a fan of Ron Paul. As much as I'm neutral in the primary, Ron Paul is a fringe candidate, and I don't think Ron Paul represents the Republicans' best foot forward. And so I'm bothered by all this tremendously on the merits of it and on the impact his image could have coming out of Iowa as a Republican winner. But also, 4 years ago, and I just looked this up, he got 10 percentage points in Iowa, 8% in New Hampshire, 4% in South Carolina, and 3% in Florida. Iowa's historically been his strongest state. He ran before. Remember, not just Mitt Romney who ran, Ron Paul ran, and Iowa was his high water mark. He plunged from there on.
You know, Gloria, Go ahead, Eric. Go ahead.
Well, you know, I think there's another relevant point here that needs to be asked of Ron Paul. If you go back to these writings, one of the things that was in one of these writings, the Ron Paul Freedom Report, that had no byline, was written in first person as if it was from Ron Paul, was that gay men were trying to intentionally infect the American blood supply by giving blood donations while having AIDS and to infect the heterosexual population. Ron Paul's supporters frequently attack Barack Obama for sitting in Reverend Jeremiah Wright's church. And Barack Obama has denied ever hearing Jeremiah Wright sermons. How is Ron Paul's denial of knowing these things any different from going after Barack Obama for the Reverend Wright matter? There is none. They can't defend that.
Well, I mean, and again, to be clear, the congressman has disavowed all of these remarks. I read some of those same remarks as well. Gloria, I mean, you talked to him today. Let me ask you this, if you can comment on what Eric said, but also, what does this mean for the Iowa caucus in general? I mean, he's at the top, despite all of this news that's most recent.
Well, you know, I mean, I spoke with the governor of the state of Iowa, Governor Branstad, yesterday about this, and I said, what if Ron Paul wins? Because lots of establishment Republicans are saying if Ron Paul wins, the Iowa caucuses are completely irrelevant. And, of course, he doesn't want that to be the case. So he says what's important is who comes in second and who comes in third. Of course, that's important. But as Ari Fleischer says, this is not the message the Republican Party wants to be sending. But I'll tell you this. I was at a Ron Paul event earlier in the day. It was a full house. And the message that resonates here is a message of anti-Washington, anti-big government, anti-debt, anti-deficit, anti-establishment. And it works with voters who are angry about the economy. So there is a real connection here with the voters in Iowa.
Well, it'll be really interesting to see where the ads go from here, and certainly what happens over the next several days. Wish we had more time to talk about it. Appreciate your time, Eric Erickson, Ari Fleischer, Gloria Borger.